You sat before this committee and promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You sat in my office and promised, you and I discussed this at great length in my office, you promised you would use every tool you have to stop the pipeline. You put out a public statement in March that explicitly warned, quote, any entity involved in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline risks U.S. sanctions and should immediately abandon work on the pipeline. But then, unfortunately, the Biden administration decided to waive those sanctions for Nord Stream 2 AG, the umbrella group building the pipeline, and for its CEO. In doing so, the Biden administration all but ensured this pipeline will be completed, because I assume you have made a decision to embrace Angela Merkel, and in doing so, to allow this pipeline to be completed even though it puts billions of dollars in the pockets of Vladimir Putin. It weakens Europe, it makes Europe more dependent on Russia for energy, and it hurts American jobs. Why did Joe Biden decide to waive the bipartisan sanctions and give what is in effect a multi-billion-dollar gift to Vladimir Putin?
Senator, it won't surprise you to know that I disagree with your assessment across the board, but just to focus on the pipeline, I think we're also apparently not working from the same fact set, because under your chronology, miraculously, the construction of the pipeline had been not only halted, but could not have been very far along, and then somehow suddenly,
with respect, it was 90% complete in 2019 when the sanctions went into effect. So the statement you made earlier that it was 90% complete, there was nothing you can do, that was true a year ago, and the sanctions worked.
Well, it was 90% more than 90% complete based on the information we had when we came to office.
That was true a year ago when the sanctions were passed.
And what we saw and what we've seen is the companies finding workarounds, finding alternatives. As one company would drop out, another would drop in. The Russians were able to bring to bear.
Prior to the Biden team suggesting sanctions wouldn't be imposed, had they returned to building the pipeline?
We didn't suggest that sanctions wouldn't be imposed. I think
was the quote from Nicholas Burns not accurate?
Mr. Burns was not a member of the administration. There was no administration at that point. But beyond that, had the Germans,
you say it's purely coincidence that it began on January 24th?
Had the Germans agreed?
It started in November, shortly after the election in 2020, when an individual, Nicholas Burns, who was identified as an advisor to then President-elect Biden, told a German newspaper that, quote, the Americans must suspend sanctions in return for a temporary halt to Nord Stream 2. Now, that message from the incoming Biden team was heard loud and clear, which is why the Moscow Times quoted the German foreign minister as saying, of course, we are very interested in discussing the Nord Stream 2 topic with the new administration in Washington. That initial sign of weakness was heard, and in late December, the Russians resumed construction. For a year it had been dormant. Late December, they resumed construction in German waters. But it wasn't yet done. The second wave of sanctions that we passed into law still gave them pause. They threatened to resume construction in deep-sea Danish waters on January 15th. But they didn't dare. They didn't dare because they believed the outgoing Trump administration would impose sanctions. And they recommenced construction of the pipeline in Danish waters on January 24th, 5 days after President Biden was sworn into office. They did so because they were convinced that the Biden administration would not enforce the sanctions. The Biden administration came in the first week in office, ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which has prompted the worst illegal immigration crisis in 20 years. In the Middle East, the Biden administration inherited a flowering of peace with the historic Abraham Accords. And the Biden administration came in and began undermining our friend and ally, the State of Israel, sent over $250 million to the Palestinian Authority, which is in bed with Hamas, which announced even this week that they are continuing to fund the families of terrorists who murder innocent civilians and they're now doing so in effect because money is fungible with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And as a result of those foreign policy blunders, what had been historic peace became war in recent weeks in the Middle East. But I think there's no area in which the foreign policy blunders have been greater than concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2. You are not surprised that I am making this point to you today. I think it is useful to pause for a moment and reflect on the successes we had as a nation concerning Russia and Nord Stream 2 and just how President Biden has given those away. In the summer and fall of 2019, I introduced in this committee bipartisan sanctions to stop the construction of Nord Stream 2, the natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. I did so along with Senator Shaheen. It was overwhelmingly bipartisan. Indeed, every Democrat on this committee supported it, and all but one Republican on this committee supported it. At the time, there was considerable Russian disinformation being pushed in Europe. The Russian disinformation said the pipeline is nearly complete. As they said later that year, the pipeline is 90% complete. You cannot stop it. The sanctions cannot work. The Russians pushed that relentlessly. We now know that disinformation was a lie. The Congress passed that bipartisan legislation into law. It was signed into law, if my memory serves me correctly, at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. At 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the president signed those bipartisan sanctions into law, the company building the pipeline announced they were immediately halting construction. So the Russian disinformation was exactly that. It was a lie, and the sanctions worked. From that moment, for the next year, the pipeline lay dormant and fallow, and there was no construction. The next year, in December of 2020, I introduced, along with Senator Shaheen, a second wave of bipartisan sanctions that passed into law, ratcheting up the punishment even more. And then, unfortunately, the Biden administration came in and turned this incredible bipartisan victory for America into a colossal failure.
And I think, Walden, I'll start with you. You mentioned, as Senator Klobuchar did, as others have, that the last set of elections were the most secure elections ever. You accepted that and have repeated that. It seems to me, based on that, there'd be no reason to have this discussion unless you could create a false narrative, in my view, that somehow states are passing massive legislation that changes the voting structure to people's disadvantage. Now, that's different than individual members of the legislature introducing bills. You said the last set of legislative bills are more bills than usual. Now, actually, I think on the Republican side, 22 bills of those bills are in Arizona, and 22 or so of those bills are in Georgia, which I suspect my back of the envelope calculation would indicate that the 4, 5, or 6 bills in other states is about right. Believe me, politicians believe they are election experts, and there are always bills passed, always bills filed, almost none of which pass. Every article on this topic cites your organization and all of this voter suppressing legislation that, one, all isn't voter suppressing, and two, just simply is not going to become law. It's a great excuse to upend a system that served the country well for a long time. On the Utah bill, for instance, that I cited earlier, HB 12 requires the lieutenant governor, who's the chief election authority, to provide Social Security data of deceased individuals to county clerks so they can begin the process of removing deceased individuals from the voter rolls. Why would that be voter suppression?
Well, thank you, Senator. When we look at legislation across the country, we look to see whether the measure is potentially restricting or suppressing.
All right, just on the question I asked, why would that bill, removing dead people from the voter rolls based on Social Security information, be voter suppression?
Because there are frequently errors in the lists that are used in Social Security and other. And
So your view would be the federal government is not capable of telling the state which Social Security recipients died and no longer get a check. So we should turn the entire election over to a federal structure. I just don't agree.
Senator
with
Blunt, can we allow the witness to answer the question,
No,
please?
No?
No?
The witness,
No?
the witness did answer the question. The witness answered the question,
Okay, we'll
Secretary.
clarify it.
Senator,
We'll clarify it later.
Senator, the witness answered the question by saying the federal government often is in error in giving information to the states. That was the answer to the question.